Republicans who preceded Donald Trump were not responsive to what voters in the Republican Party were saying in '08, in 12, that they didn't want forever wars, that their economic reality was not what they wanted it to be, that free trade and all the other things that Republicans used to stand for were not working in their lives. And so that's how Donald Trump prevails. He doesn't hijack the Republican Party. He is the reaction to voters feeling like politicians weren't responsive to their needs. So the fact that he's now creating the exact same dynamic on the other side is, I know we live in post-truth America. I know we live in post-irony America, but it is, to me, one of the great ironies of his inability to recognize this moment.
It's such a great point. And just keep it in Michigan. Donald Trump wins in 2016 as a reaction. They think he's going to disrupt politics. He loses in 2020 after voters in Michigan watch his administration. He wins in 2024. So there is that reaction to people thinking someone new's got to come along to change some things or do things differently. So to the second part of my question, Nicole, the front page of the New York Post, as you might expect, but also the Wall Street Journal editorial page, essentially saying this begins now, the nomination of El Sayed, as the Journal puts it, the march of the El Sayed Democrats, the march of Democrats to the left, which the paper believes benefits Republicans. Are they right?
I mean, the Journal, if you, again, look at the same 10-year swath, hasn't been right about a lot, and they've done more laundering of Donald Trump's real sort of character atrocities than anyone else by trying to cherry pick the things that happen to align with what they stand for. So I wouldn't put a lot of credence in that. I think that there are bigger brand problems that Democrats have, and they're in that first point, right? I think a lot of voters just want someone that'll fight for their feeling that nothing is going their way, that even when they vote for change, they don't get the change they're looking for. I think there are a lot of candidates David Jolly is the Democratic nominee for governor in Florida. James Tallarico is someone that Joe Rogan said he wished would win for president because, quote, he's a good person. And I think that the Wall Street Journal cherry picking one race to focus on is certainly their prerogative. But if you look at the Democratic Party trying to, again, be responsive to what voters have said, they have a pretty diverse field of candidates on the ballot in November. And that doesn't mean the Journal will focus on that. I'm sure they'll focus on this race instead. But I think the reality for people when they're struggling and when everything is getting more expensive, and Trump doesn't seem to know where he is. I mean, Trump used to be very good at speaking to that economic anxiety and tying it to some crazy stuff. He called it the weave. Last night, he didn't appear to know what state he was in.
Yeah, and I think we've seen from Trump, he's lost touch. He used to have, like him or dislike him, the guy had a real finger on the pulse of what the country, or at least his base, cared about. And I think that has really faded, in part because of this bubble he lives in now. Frankly, it's striking that he's out in the country at all. He so rarely does that. And Mark Leibovich, it also seems to be that the Republicans settling on this Red Scare argument, the communism or socialism, they don't know the difference, is out of desperation because they know they can't point to a lot of things that are working for them. I wrote in the Atlantic last night about how Trump, deeply frustrated, but also embarrassed by how the reflecting pool went. Embarrassed about the fact they had to ground the new Air Force One. These are two, because it wasn't safe enough for him. These are two things he really cares about, and that's revealing. His priorities are not helping the American people. They're not trying to deal with affordability, but rather just monuments in Washington or things to enrich himself or his friends. And we're seeing him lash out, and that's just reinforcing the idea, and polls reflect it, Americans think he simply is out of touch and doesn't care about what they're going through.
I mean, I think in many ways that was reflected in the remarks that were played earlier. I mean, he seems like he's mailing it in a little bit. I mean, I think the whole Red Scare thing sort of conjures the idea, certainly the 50s. It's like, okay, people have asked sort of rhetorically over the last several years, okay, so let's make America great again. When was this mythical America that Donald Trump always talks about? I mean, I guess there's sort of this rough idea that it was around maybe the 40s and 50s or something. And that's the Red Scare. But obviously, not a single mention of Mike Rogers, the opponent of Abdul El Sayed, who is, a candidate who can definitely win statewide in Michigan, who's been, he's pretty moderate. He could appeal quite well to the electorate there. And obviously, the Democrats are really rolling the dice with this guy. I mean, this is not a united front in that party by any stretch. If you look at the results of the primary on Monday, Hallie Stevens and El Sayed were within a few points of each other. So obviously, El Sayed has a lot of work to do. But I think it sort of you sort of see the problems of the two parties right there. One being, the Democrats' sort of identity crisis, and on the other hand, the Republicans and certainly the administration not having a lot to run on.
Elise, one of the things that's woven through this political year, we've been discussing it not only just today, not just now, but forever, and it's depressing to talk about it, the changes in the way government has operated, the way that changes have affected people in this country. One of the things that sort of stands out, if you just look around at normal American life, which too few American politicians do, I think, is the level of cruelty in some of the cuts that the government under Donald Trump is making on an everyday basis. Cruelty aimed at people who have a tough time anyway, and it's disturbing.
Well, and also the cuts that are aimed disproportionately to punish blue states. So there's that, too. And little concern for America as a whole and being some kind of leader for all. And I think that's what you see the fissures and the anger coming out, especially in a state like Michigan, when you have primary voters who are really angry over how the Iran war has hit them disproportionately in the state of Michigan. It's hit their industry, it's spiked their gas, and it's made the cost of living more expensive. And so there's anger there that I think we saw reflected in how the primary voters defied party leadership.
And in Nevada, where he was yesterday, gas is way up, tourism is way down, and he mocks the idea of affordability. He stands there at an affordability event. We also get a little look, Nicole, behind the curtain of this administration. Your new interview of former acting FBI Director Brian Driscoll for the new episode of your podcast, The Best People, talking about the state of the FBI under Director Kash Patel and rebuilding that institution after Donald Trump. It included a discussion about U.S. Circuit Judge Emil Bovey's previous stint at the Justice Department when he demanded lists of agents who worked on Trump cases. Here's that exchange.
And they wanted all those people fired?
He never said that it was with the intent to fire them. However, to hand over a list while also having digested all of the rhetoric coming from outside of our building, elsewhere in the executive branch and elsewhere in the government, I, again, made a personal assessment and decided I was unwilling, unless it was told to me that it was a legal order, to submit the true names of almost, if not more than 6,000 FBI employees who worked those sensitive investigations against the people that were held responsible. Agents, analysts, and professional staff, some of whom were threatened by those people who we held accountable, that were responsible for those events, without full confidence that I wasn't walking them to the edge of a cliff of their employment to watch somebody else kick them off. Also, to potentially risk having their true name compromised, released, and then the threats to them and their families. I was not willing to tolerate that. Now, eventually, I was surrounded by very brilliant attorneys on the FBI side, a lot of former prosecutors who reflected that after I was internally very resistant, and I was willing to provide a list with one name, my own. And that's not, I'm not saying that to be like, look at me, I'm a martyr. Not at all. But
just to give him a scalp.
Yeah.
So, Nicole, let's remind people, Brian Driscoll was the acting FBI director on day one, January 20th, 2025, of this Trump administration, and was asked, for example, to unmask, as he said, FBI agents who worked on January 6 cases and refused to do so.
Yeah, and there were 6,000 people who touched the January 6 cases. It was, as we all know from covering it, this extraordinary crime that took place on live television. And it was, on the other side, the largest crime ever investigated by the FBI. What's interesting to me, to pick up on Mike Barnichel's point about cruelty, is that the retribution campaign that Donald Trump has talked about really since the first day of his first term. I mean, he first was known to want to indict Hillary Clinton and Jim Comey in 2017. So he's always wanted to use the FBI and the Department of Justice to prosecute his enemies and shield himself. That's a forever thing about Donald Trump. The retribution campaign only happens in the second term because men like Emil Bobe and Todd Blanche become Trump's willing accomplices in carrying that out. And that's what, to me, is so shocking, because never before has someone gone into that building and been willing to purge people who stand on the line between the United States of America and al-Qaeda, between the United States of America and ISIS, between the United States of America and Russia, between the United States of America and China. And what they've done in purging anyone that worked on a case where Donald Trump happened to be the target of the Mar-a-Lago investigation, for example, he absconded national defense information. So that's why national security people were involved in that case, to try to figure out what sources and methods could have been compromised by all the stuff in those white boxes that, again, are just demonstrably true acts that Donald Trump engaged in. And so to listen to him talk about the really hundreds of years of people who protected this country after 9/11 from anything like that ever happening again was really, really, really chilling.
Nicole, as you know, just from talking to Brian Driscoll, I would imagine, that they lost a lot of really talented people who were fired at the FBI. Did Brian Driscoll have any thoughts about how long or whether it's possible to rebuild the FBI to some commensurate level that it was 4 or 5 years ago?
So he said, he's dying to go back in. He said he'll go in and clean the canine dog kennels. He'll go in and drive a truck, or he'll go in and help rebuild it. And he said that of the 6 associate directors who were fired very early in his tenure, that he hasn't pulled them all, but he's not heard of anyone who isn't also willing to go in and rebuild this institution they love.